Kate Brehme is a disabled independent curator, a researcher and arts educator whose work explores access aesthetics and Crip joy. She's British and Australian, but she's based in Berlin. She is the co-founder of Berlinklusion, a collective working with both disabled and non-disabled artists and professionals, and advocating for inclusion in the arts. I discovered Kate Brehme's work while preparing this symposium, and I was immediately struck by the clarity with which you speak about disability aesthetics and about access as a catalyst for creativity. One of the themes that is at the heart of this symposium is how can we shift narratives around disability? And I want to ask you, as a curator, what is your view? What is the role of a curator in shifting those narratives? Hello.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to the Hartung-Bergman Foundation for inviting me. Before I answer the question, I'm just going to give a very brief visual description of myself. This is something that I always do whenever I speak, so that people who can't see are also able to access the visual. I'm a very short white woman with dark, very short curly hair with some grey in it. Some dark framed glasses, and today I'm wearing mostly black except for a bright red shirt with lots of tigers on it, which I hope will give me some power for the rest of the afternoon. What do we need to shift narratives? I think we need more disabled people in positions of power in the arts. Generally in society as well, but definitely within the arts. Within art history, in curatorial positions, on the stage, but also behind the stage in production, management, these kinds of roles. I think part of the reason why I see such potential in access is because, having lived with a disability myself my whole life and having access as part of my day-to-day life, it enables me to do things. It's shown me that it can be something extremely positive and extremely creative. I've dedicated the last 20 years of my curatorial practice working with disabled artists, not just, but many disabled artists. And over that time, it's always been a collaborative effort to talk about what our needs are, what our bodily needs are, what our human needs are, and to bring that into the curatorial process, to bring that into the creative process, putting on exhibitions together, displaying artwork together, and seeing how those needs can be met, not just in a very technical way, box ticking, as we often see in the arts. Okay, our project is now inclusive because we've got our sign language, we've got our, I don't know, lift or whatever, but thinking about how access can be done in really innovative and beautiful ways, how it can become an artwork itself or part of the artwork itself.
And you told me that it was also very important, and I mentioned that you introduce yourself as a disabled independent curator. So also, if you would like to say a word about that and the importance of making this part of your work visible.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I forgot to mention in my visual description was that sitting next to me, next to my armrest of this very comfy chair, which I'm very grateful for, thank you, is my cane, which I use not all the time, but every now and then. And I've only started using this in the last year. My chronic illness flared up quite badly last year, so it's something that I've had to take on, I didn't have beforehand. But it's a really useful visual tool that I use to show people my disability. And this is also why I mention it, why I say in my biography, why I introduce myself as a disabled curator. I think for far too long, particularly in the visual arts, in arts history, there is so much stigma surrounding disability, even though, you know, in our contemporary society, it's often seen as something that falls under that banner of diversity, that disability belongs to other markers of identification, so being black, being a person of color, being queer, etc. However, in the reality, there is still so much uncomfortableness. And I think particularly in the visual arts, where throughout history we've seen examples of the disabled body stigmatized as a deficit, as a sin from God, or as an example of somebody who's done something wrong, as a victim. Even though actually we can see throughout history that, not all disabled people were victims. Actually, they were incredible, amazing people with strength and resilience. So for me, reclaiming this identity is about transforming the definition of disability, as many, many, many disabled activists and ancestors have gone before me to do this in various different disability justice movements around the world. So it's incredibly important to me. I'm proud to be disabled. It's not easy to live with a disability, absolutely not. But I'm proud to be somebody who has that experience. It's made me who I am. I can't separate it from my life, and I can't separate it from my work either, and nor should I.
For sure. And it is true that, as we said, disability has long been overlooked and marginalized and often erased from art history. And this has a lasting impact on the way disability is still perceived today. So could you tell us about a project that illustrates how your curatorial practice builds bridges between past and present, between art history and contemporary art, and also particularly the use of archives in some of your projects? And I think it's time maybe to show the first images that you wanted to share with us.
I'm just skipping ahead here to... This is Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer, the exhibition at the Schwules Museum, or the Gay Museum in Berlin from 2022 to 2023. What we see on the screen here is a rather large white gallery space. You can see that we have a range of different black benches skirting the walls, and on top of those benches you have lots of information about the exhibition. The benches are wheelchair accessible. You can get underneath whilst you're looking at things on the top. And above these benches on the walls are various different artworks. We have lots of video artworks. We have posters and pamphlets from various different activist movements, photography, and you can see just in the distance a large-scale image of Lorenza Böttner, a very important, what we would now call trans artist. And you can also see the various different kind of aids we had in the room to make the exhibition accessible. So lots of headphones. We had various different audio descriptions of the artwork, as well as a tactile floor system for blind people with stops in front of select artworks. You can also see a little bit in the distance, it looks like a bed. It's kind of an extended bench that we created for people to sit and lie down in the exhibition, because we wanted this exhibition to embrace all kinds of different bodies to feel comfortable in the space. I'm skipping ahead a little bit to talk to your question, Anne, about archives. So Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer was an exhibition project I was invited to join by the author and activist Kenny Freeze, originally from the United States, but based now in Berlin for quite some time. Kenny is a Jewish, gay, disabled person who I think many people in the US context know him. He's a very central figure in terms of disability politics there, has written countless memoirs about his experience as someone who is affected by various different forms of marginalization in society. And Kenny invited me to be part of this project so that we could create a true queer Crip team to run the exhibition. We were interested particularly in the overlapping experiences of queer and disabled people throughout history. We realized that after some preliminary research, nobody had ever done an exhibition on this topic that looked internationally at the various different movements that had taken place, what kind of activism arose, but also looking at history itself and looking at how seminal moments throughout history, eugenics, National Socialism, affected not just queer people but also disabled people, and how similar those experiences, or how similar those structures of oppression were, and how similar experiences were. So we embarked on this project to not just delve into archives. We looked at the archive of the Schulers Museum and had a look through their collection to see what objects and contemporary artworks they had that told these stories. I mean, they have an amazing archive there of queer history, not just of Berlin, but also Germany and broader. They've been around for quite some time, so their collection is quite vast. But they never really dealt with disability within their exhibition making, even just in terms of looking at their archives and how the archives were structured or categorized. There was no field where you could just go on the computer and look up disability or disabled artists, even though there were stories in there, even though there were disabled artists or people featured in the collection. This is one such story. Here on the screen is a collection of old photographs and documents from Hans Heinrich Festersen, who was a young man during Nazi Germany who had cerebral palsy. He was also a gay man who was arrested for being gay and then eventually murdered by the Nazis for being disabled. This is an incredibly important history, and it's a history that actually is very, very seldom known. I think most people in a German context understand the history of National Socialism. They understand what happened during the Holocaust to Jewish people. What many people don't fully understand is that disabled people were actually the first test victims of the Nazis. So in order to test out the procedures that would kill Jewish people, this was something that was done on disabled people first. The reason being was that they were determined by the Nazis as not worthy of life. And this is something I think that is really important for everybody to realize and take note of. We wanted to draw people's attention to this history, to this really, really crucial part of history and that overlap, because it wasn't just disabled people who were deemed as not worthy of life, but also queer people, homeless people, alcoholics, people with intellectual disabilities, all kinds of people that didn't fit a social norm in society. We started the exhibition with a look at actually rather a question rather than a statement. It was the question, where do these body norm ideals come from? When were they first created? And you can trace this back to the ancient Greeks, you can trace this back to mythology, you can trace this idea of, beauty all the way back. And we wanted to challenge that. We wanted to ask this question. We don't have very much historical information around, what did disabled people do in this time? How were they seen? How were they viewed? But what we can trace back is, very clear ideas about beauty being associated very strongly with able-bodiedness or an idea of able-bodiedness. And we wanted to question that and ask, well, actually, from the perspective of disabled people, our bodies are beautiful too, but they're beautiful in different ways. So how can we show that and how can we celebrate that?
There is one thing that is really central to your work is the collaborative process and the fact that, as you said, you work with disabled and non-disabled professionals and activists and artists. So how concretely do you conceive a project in collaboration with different people?
I think maybe it's funny because I've often, and maybe this is because of the way in which disabled people are not invited to join the table as curators. For me, there were very few role models when I went to art school. I didn't know anybody who had a disability who was, working as a curator. It took me until my 40s to meet other curators with disabilities. Maybe they had disabilities but never actually came out as disabled. And actually this is also true for me too, that it was something that I hid for a really long time. And I think there was also a lot of questioning of how can I be a curator but also be somebody who has a chronic illness? How do these two things come together? And there were many, many times where I really questioned whether I could do it or whether I should just leave the art sector completely. But over the years, I found colleagues who, like myself, had disabilities or had worked a lot with other people with disabilities. And I think I managed to carve out a practice that resisted this really ableist system of working. Ableism is the discrimination of people with disabilities or anyone who's not deemed to fit into society norm, embodied norm. And I think I cultivated a way of working with other people so that we could share labour, so that we could have our access needs met in order to be able to still work curatorially. And I can talk a little bit more about that in a moment with the Unruly Splendour exhibition, but maybe just in terms of how this collective working enabled us to meet our audience's needs. When I joined the team for the Queering the Crip exhibition with Kenny, Kenny obviously knows a lot about disability, also knows a lot about queerness, being a queer person himself, but he didn't know everything. Kenny is a writer, first and foremost, and had limited experience working in museums, whereas I had plenty. Kenny hadn't worked with many visually impaired people before. There were lots of areas of his knowledge, that he didn't have, that he lacked. So, working together, I was able to bring my knowledge into the team, and working with the rest of the team at the museum, we're able to introduce new concepts to them. So the concept of, what are access aesthetics? How can we, create a really beautiful exhibition that makes sure it's very accessible in many different ways, very multisensorial, but not compromise on the aesthetics, still make a show that looked beautiful or felt welcoming. And, it was probably one of the first experiences that I'd had as a curator working on such an ambitious project with an established museum where that process was very open. The museum staff were incredibly open. And I don't think we would have been able to implement a lot of access for our audiences had they not been willing to shift their ideas around museum exhibition making.
It's interesting what you say, because I believe also you're pointing out the fact that making a project, putting access at the core of a project is also requires time and humility, which is also maybe something that is not a quality that is maybe not well shared among humanity and the art world. So this question also of being able to listen to different people's needs. And I guess it's also what you're bringing is also your experience as an arts educator. So the idea that you're working with different professionals, and of course you mentioned the museum professionals and you as a curator working with artists, but also the audience and how the artworks will be perceived. And this is also such an important part. Would you like to take us through the example of Unruly Splendour so we can understand how you engaged also the audiences with this process?
I will land here. I think this is a nice image. Okay, so I'll start with the image because that's a nice way to get into the story of Unruly Splendour. What we see on screen here is an image of a white gallery space. You have a very low bench, that is a white bench that's sitting underneath a window. We can see outside the window are beautiful lush green trees. On top of this bench is a series of different vessels, glass bottles. And they look a little bit like medical samples of something. They each have a little black lid. They're clear. And we can see that each bottle has a little label on it. And inside the bottles is liquid. And inside that liquid are various different types of flowers, seed pods, insects, leaves, and other types of flora. This is an artwork by the artist R.A. Walden, a disabled artist from the UK who up until recently was based in Berlin. The work is called Crip Ecologies, and it explored R.A.'s lack of access to the natural world as a disabled person. The exhibition Unruly Splendour was a way for us to, and I say us because I co-curated it together with my Berlinklusion colleague, Kirsten Broussard. It was a way for us to explore our human connection with nature, but looking at that through difference and embodied difference. So how do different bodies engage with nature, but also seeing nature as a metaphor for the body and seeing nature with its cycles and rhythms, but also its unruliness, its wildness, its often surprising but beautiful way in which it will ultimately always do its own thing. If anyone has ever tried to garden, you will know exactly what I mean. And I am a gardener, and actually that was the genesis of this exhibition. That, we were thinking a lot about physical spaces and how as human beings we often try and make nature conform. And we do that with our bodies as well. And this is how ableism functions. It really tries to restrict the body and fit it into a capitalist model of being, working, existing in the world. We were incredibly inspired by disability justice activism that looks at ableism and looks at this, neo-capitalist structure that we have in the world and really tries to resist that and say, no, actually, disabled bodies will never fit into this mold. We have to find our own time, Crip time. We have to find and follow our own bodily rhythms, and we need to respect them as we need to respect nature.
And if I'm correct, also the Unruly Splendour was also close to a Baroque garden, and there was this connection also with the norms and this way of controlling.
Exactly, yes. It was within a Baroque garden, a neo-Baroque garden, a beautiful park. Berlin has many, many lovely gardens and parks, and this particular space was a garden that was owned previously by one of Berlin's elite. He was responsible for basically creating, much of the architecture of Neukölln, a suburb in Berlin. And he gifted this garden to the public. The gallery is in an old orangerie. And of course, if anyone knows the history of orangeries, they were very much spaces that were created to extend the life of usually exotic plants and trees to deal with very harsh Berlin winters and keep them alive. We thought this was a really interesting connection. We very much took inspiration from that history of the space and very much saw this idea of the orangerie, which is also a colonial product of architecture, if you look at the history, the importation of, so-called exotic plants. And, we were interested in looking at that intersection and overlap as well. It was no coincidence that we had many different artists of colour in our exhibition as well. One in particular, Anne Duquy, who explores the relationship between colonisation and Dutch colonisation of Indonesia, which is where she's from, but looks at that through various different forms of nature as well. So looking at tracing back the legacies and histories of seeds or flowers and spices. So these works, they really kind of allowed us to have not just one conversation around disability, but allowed us to look at bodies and the various different ways in which bodies are constricted, oppressed, but also allowed to thrive given the right conditions.
There is the next image is about someone having a sensory experience within this exhibition. Could you also tell us a bit more about the way you work around those sensory experiences?
Sure. You asked me at the beginning, I'm going to bring it back full circle because you asked me at the beginning around how disability is a part of my curatorial practice. And what's really important for me is that my body, as well as other disabled bodies and also non-disabled bodies, feel comfortable in my exhibitions. My colleague Kirsten, who actually has the same chronic illness that I have, we worked really hard to create a space that would allow our bodies to rest. We had lots of different seats, benches, bean bags, different ways in which you could relax in the space. I mean, it's quite a beautiful space. You can actually sit there and really just kind of enjoy the outside as well as the inside. But it's also a harsh space. There's terracotta tiles on the ground. They're a bit hard. There weren't that many seats in the beginning, so we brought some extra ones in. But also thinking about how we could make the artworks themselves a lot more accessible. And we did that through talking with each artist. We had a conversation with each artist around the possibility for visitors to interact with the work in different ways. So could people touch the work? If so, how could they touch the work? Could they smell something? Could they hear something? Could they, move their body around the work to see it better or to feel it better? And there were quite a few pieces that were touchable, but then there were other pieces that weren't. And for the ones that weren't, we created a series of different tactile objects for people to touch, and these were selected by the artist. So that was also a very nice gesture that we asked each artist to pick something for their future visitors. And so these boxes have various different objects relating to each artwork, so people could feel them, they could smell things. I mentioned Duqui before, and she worked with the spice nutmeg in her artwork, and you couldn't touch it in the actual artwork, but we provided, samples that people could pick up and rub between their fingers and smell and feel or look at in closer detail. We had an audio guide that we created ourselves, a walkthrough of the exhibition, taking people to each artwork and describing it visually, but also inviting people to touch things, talking a little bit more about the history of the space, and really trying to offer people a multi-layered experience of the exhibition. It was very, very popular, not just with disabled people, but with children, with older people, a wide variety of people who normally don't feel invited and aren't invited to do this with their bodies in contemporary art spaces.
I think what you said just expanded the definition of accessibility to access aesthetics, right? I think you helped us to understand also the shift that needs to happen. My last question is about your work as a curator, but also your passion for gardening. I don't know if it's a personal interpretation of your work, but I would be interested, and I think that we see that there is something very organic in the way you work, collaborating with different people. So how would you explain this connection? Is there a connection between gardening and curating, between nature and the arts? There is, of course.
It's really funny that you ask me this, because it's definitely not up until very recently, it was not conscious at all. I think, in my personal life, gardening is very much a way for me to have those moments of rest and respite, to feel joyful, to feel free, but also to lose control a little bit and to be okay with losing control and sitting back and letting things take their own way and their own life, and being being patient. It really forces you to be patient. I'm not a patient person whatsoever, and it's really only been recently that I've really been deliberately interested in the garden. I think Unruly Splendour was the first opportunity that I had to really look at it and explore it curatorially as a theme. And after this, it really allowed me to dive a little bit deeper into this. And I don't know if anybody is familiar with the work of Johanna Hedva, who is a disabled artist based in the States. If you don't know their work, please look them up. They are amazing. Has written several books and created an essay about 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer, called Sick Woman Theory, which has become very, very well known in Crip activist circles. And Hedva writes a lot about respecting natural cycles and listening to the body. And it was something that I don't know, it really spoke to me. I think I would like to think that I work organically. I'm glad that you see that. I think for me, I draw immense joy from working with artists. I don't know if that's because maybe I'm a failed artist myself. I went to art school and trained, but really, I was much better at pulling everyone together into an exhibition rather than making my own work. But there is nothing more profound for me than working with people who can transform ideas into works of art in many different ways. And I don't know, I get a lot of joy out of, working with other colleagues to take on the challenge of, okay, we have this artwork or we have this artistic idea. How can we manifest that in a way that it reaches as many people as possible? It's a form of communication about what it is to be human. And that for me is so incredibly, I'm so lucky that I get to do that.
Thank you so much, Picq.